In a Rhode Island mill village in 1841, a working day didn't start with a clock. It started with a bell. One bell for the whole village, rung by the company that owned the mill, the tenements around it, the store where you bought your flour, and very often the church you prayed in on Sunday. The bell told you when to wake. It told you when to walk. It told you at the end of 13 hours when you were finally allowed to stop. Most of the people answering that bell weren't single young women boarding together for a few independent years, the way you might picture from the famous mill towns of Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, the system ran differently, and it ran on something closer to home. Whole families working the same floor, under the same roof, 6 days a week, for wages so small they were counted in cents rather than dollars. This is a story about one of those families, about the neighbors who kept them fed when the machines took more than they were supposed to, about the immigrants down the road who prayed in a language the town didn't trust, and the free black barber across the river who understood the political game better than almost anyone playing it. And running underneath all of it, quietly, for most of the year, a fight over who in this state was even allowed to vote on any of it at all. We'll get to that fight, but first, an ordinary week. Nathaniel Cobb is 26, his wife Eliza is 24. Their daughter Ruth is 10, and she has been working the mill floor for a year and a half already, tending a spinning frame small enough that she has to stand on a wooden block to reach it properly. Their son Josiah is 7, too young yet for the machines, which mostly means he spends his days minding the youngest Cobb, a toddler named Mercy, in 2 rented rooms above a shop that belongs, like nearly everything else in this village, to the mill. Nathaniel is on the floor by 4:30, before the sky has fully committed to being morning. Eliza and Ruth follow an hour later, after the youngest 2 are fed and settled. The building itself never really goes quiet. The water wheel outside turns whether or not the workers inside are awake to hear it. And once the belts and spindles start, they run without pause from first bell to last, a mechanical hum that gets into your teeth after enough years of standing near it. The air on the carding floor is thick with cotton lint, fine enough to breathe without noticing, until years later when a cough that never quite clears tells you exactly how much of it you took in. By midday, there's a short break, barely long enough to eat standing up. Bread, sometimes a bit of salt pork, whatever Eliza managed to pack that morning before the second bell. Ruth eats hers with cotton dust still on her hands, because there's no real place on the floor to wash them, and no time to look for one. The afternoon runs longer than the morning feels, the light through the high windows shifting from white to gold to gray, while the machines keep exactly the same pace they kept at dawn. By the time the last bell rings, it's often full dark, especially in winter. Nathaniel and Eliza walk home together with Ruth between them, all 3 of them moving slower than they did 12 hours earlier, past other families doing exactly the same thing on exactly the same street, toward exactly the same kind of narrow rented rooms. There is no evening in any leisurely sense. There's supper, there's mending or firewood, or whatever the house needs that particular night, and then there's sleep. Because the bell doesn't care how tired you are when it rings again the next morning. What the Cobb family is living through has an actual name. It's called the Rhode Island system, and it was pioneered 50 years earlier by an English mechanic named Samuel Slater, who built the country's first successful water-powered cotton mill just down the Blackstone River in Pawtucket in 1790. Unlike the corporate boarding houses that would later make Lowell, Massachusetts famous, built specifically to house unmarried farm girls for a few respectable years before marriage, Slater's model hired entire families as a single working unit. The father directed the labor of his wife and children. The wages, such as they were, came home as one household sum rather than several individual ones. Children as young as 7 or 8 weren't an exception to a Rhode Island mill's workforce. They were assumed to be part of it. Here's what a working day in a Blackstone Valley mill actually looked like in the early 1840s. 12 hours on the floor was ordinary. 13 wasn't unusual. At this exact moment, workers in nearby Massachusetts and New Jersey mills were organizing strikes specifically to bring the day down to 11 or 12 hours, which tells you plainly what the baseline actually was. A new organization calling itself the New England Association of Farmers, Mechanics, and Other Working Men had begun pushing hard for a standard 10-hour day across every industry in the region, arguing that anything longer left a working person no real time to think, to worship, or to be anything other than an extension of the machine they tended. Mill owners fought the idea fiercely, and through most of this decade, they mostly won. Wages were paid by the piece or by the day, and a family working together might, between 2 or 3 sets of hands, bring home something in the rough neighborhood of what a single, skilled tradesman earned alone. It wasn't poverty in the starving sense. It was poverty in the margin sense. One bad season, one injury, one stretch of illness away from real trouble, with almost nothing saved to absorb the shock. And the mill owners in towns like this weren't distant, invisible figures the way a modern shareholder might be. They were the landlord, the shopkeeper, the deacon, sometimes even the local magistrate, all at once. This concentration of ownership is part of why, when the fight over voting rights broke out just a year later, it landed so directly on families like the Cobbs. The man who set your wages and the man who decided whether you could vote were, in a great many Rhode Island mill towns, the exact same man. Strip away the machines for a moment and look at what actually filled a mill family's table and closet, because it tells you something the wage numbers alone don't. Breakfast in the Cobb household was usually cornmeal mush or bread, sometimes with molasses if the week had been kind. Supper leaned on whatever could be bought cheap and stretched far. Salt pork, potatoes, dried beans, bread again, occasionally a bit of fish if the season and the budget lined up. Fresh vegetables were a luxury tied tightly to the calendar. Through a New England winter, a mill family's diet narrowed considerably, and what fresh produce did appear usually came not from any garden of their own. There was no land for one, but from a peddler's cart or the company store at company prices. Clothing told its own story. A mill worker's outer clothes were plain, durable, and mended more often than replaced, because replacing them meant a real dent in a week's wages. Cotton, ironically, was cheap and increasingly common even among people who couldn't afford much else, since the very mills employing them were producing more of it than the region could use. Eliza likely owned 2 dresses in regular rotation, one for the mill floor, sturdier and already showing wear, and one kept slightly better for church and Sunday, mended carefully enough that the mending barely showed. Shoes were an expense every family in the village dreaded and planned around. Children often went without proper shoes for stretches of the year, particularly in warmer months, saving the one good pair for winter and for church. A pair of boots that fit and held together through a full New England winter wasn't a small purchase. It was closer to a small investment, weighed and debated the way a family today might weigh a major repair bill. None of this was unique suffering. It was simply what a modest working income actually bought in 1841, translated into cornmeal, salt pork, mended cotton, and shoes rationed by season. The mills didn't run on Sundays, and that single fact shaped the entire rhythm of the week around it. Sunday morning meant church, and in a mill village, church attendance wasn't purely a matter of private conscience. Mill owners strongly encouraged it, and in some company towns effectively required it, not only out of genuine piety, but because a church-going workforce was widely considered a more orderly, more manageable one. The Cobbs, like most native-born Protestant families in the village, attended a small congregational meeting house within walking distance, dressed in whatever clothes they'd kept back specifically for the occasion. After the service, Sunday became the one real stretch of unclaimed time most mill families had all week. For the Cobbs, that meant visiting, neighbors calling on neighbors, news and gossip and small kindnesses exchanged over doorsteps, the kind of loose, unhurried conversation that simply had no room to happen on a Tuesday. It meant courting, too. Young mill workers without family close enough to arrange an introduction the old-fashioned way found their partners largely among the people they already stood beside on the factory floor 6 days a week. Courtships that moved quickly by necessity, since a household needed a second income and a second pair of hands about as urgently as it needed affection. Music, where it existed, mostly lived in this one day as well. A fiddle, if a family owned one, hymns sung together in the evening, voices carrying between open windows on a warm Sunday, in a way that briefly made the whole crowded street feel almost like one shared household, rather than a dozen separate struggling ones. And running quietly underneath all of it, the same fight sweeping the rest of the country. Temperance. In a mill village, the argument over drink carried a sharper, more practical edge than it did on a farm. Because a drunk operative near an unguarded belt or spindle wasn't just a moral failing, it was a mechanical hazard that could cost someone a hand. Mill owners had real, self-interested reasons to push their workforce toward sobriety. And those reasons got tangled up, as they so often did in this decade, with genuine religious conviction, making it hard to say where practical policy ended and moral crusade began. People tend to picture 1840s New England as buttoned up and orderly. Quiet churches, tidy households, everyone exactly where they're supposed to be. The reality inside a mill village was considerably messier, and a lot of that mess had to do with control. Company rules in a village like this one extended well past the factory floor. Some mills posted formal codes of conduct governing behavior in the boarding houses and company tenements. Curfews, church attendance, restrictions on visitors, even guidelines about tidiness and moral character, all enforced with the implicit threat that a family who didn't comply could simply be dismissed and evicted in the same afternoon, since housing and employment came from the same landlord. This wasn't unique to Rhode Island, but the family-based system here meant the pressure landed on entire households at once rather than on individual boarders. And the postcard image of a single, unified religious community was misleading in its own particular way. A real and growing share of the workforce filling mills exactly like this one was Irish Catholic, worshiping in a faith that plenty of native-born New Englanders viewed with open, sometimes hostile suspicion. The village usually had at least 2 congregations that didn't especially trust each other, occupying the same streets, working the same floors, and largely keeping to their own after the last bell rang. By 1841, Rhode Island already had a substantial Irish Catholic population, and it hadn't arrived because of the famine. That catastrophe was still 4 years off. This earlier wave came for canal work, fort construction, coal mining, and factory labor throughout the 1820s and 1830s, digging the Blackstone Canal by hand, working the coal pits in Portsmouth, laboring on the construction of Fort Adams in Newport, and laying the groundwork, quite literally, for the same industrial economy now employing families like the Cobbs. Chain migration was how it worked in practice. A man would come alone, work, send money home, and use it to bring over a brother, then a cousin, then eventually a whole extended family, one relative's fare at a time. By the early 1840s, Irish Catholic communities were well established in Providence, Pawtucket, and Woonsocket, worshipping in small parishes they'd built themselves, often against real local resentment, sometimes literally brick by brick, funded out of wages barely large enough to cover their own families. The discrimination wasn't subtle. Irish workers were frequently paid less for the same labor than native-born workers doing it. Landlords in some towns refused to rent to Catholic families outright, and it wasn't uncommon for a posted job to specify, without much embarrassment, that Irish applicants need not bother inquiring. Down the street from the Cobbs, an Irish family named Halloran ran a small boarding house for unmarried Irish mill hands, in part because so few native-born landlords would rent to them at all, and their front room doubled most Sunday evenings as an informal gathering place. News from home, read aloud from a letter, small collections taken up for whichever family was next in line to bring over a relative. And crucially for the story about to unfold that spring, When reformers drew up a new voting constitution, the one meaningful concession the existing government was willing to make kept a property requirement specifically in place for anyone foreign-born, while loosening it for everyone else. The suspicion wasn't just social. It was about to be written directly into the law under debate. Winter in a mill village carried its own particular danger, one that had nothing to do with weather. One February morning, a young boarder 2 doors down from the Cobbs, a girl not much older than Ruth, caught her sleeve in an unguarded gear on the carding room floor. She survived. Her arm did not. Not in any working sense. There was no compensation for an injury like that beyond whatever the family could scrape together. No fund, no insurance, nothing but the goodwill of the neighbors who took up a collection that same week to cover the weeks of wages her family would now be short. Eliza Cobb, by the account passed down in a granddaughter's later letters, sat with the girl's mother most of that first night, the way neighbors in a mill village generally did for each other, because there was no other safety net available, and everyone understood, without needing to be told twice, that the machines didn't discriminate by household when deciding whose mourning to ruin next. Nathaniel, for his part, quietly took on part of the injured girl's father's usual shift for 2 weeks, splitting his own wages with the man without making any particular show of it, in the same unspoken arrangement that would have covered his own family if the accident had happened to Ruth instead. Ruth herself, 10 years old and already a year and a half into her own work on the spinning frames, understood the danger better than any child her age should have had to. She'd been warned about loose sleeves and loose hair since her very first week on the floor, warnings that suddenly carried a great deal more weight than they had the week before. This is the part of industrial life that rarely survives in the record. Not the strikes, not the political fights, but the quiet, ordinary machinery of neighbors showing up for each other in a system that offered them almost nothing else to fall back on. The accident on the carding room floor was the danger everyone could see. The danger nobody could see was arguably worse. Cotton lint filled the air of every room in a mill like this one, fine enough that a shift's worth of breathing, it went almost unnoticed in the moment. Workers who'd spent a decade or more on the floor developed a persistent cough that never fully cleared, something older operatives simply called the mill cough, and treated as an unavoidable cost of the trade rather than a warning anyone took seriously. Nobody in 1841 had the medical language to explain exactly what all that fine dust was doing to a person's lungs over 20 years of exposure. They only knew that the older hands wheezed, and that it seemed to get worse the longer a person stayed at the work. Water was its own quiet hazard. A mill village's water supply came from wells, and the same river turning the mill wheel, and neither was reliably clean. Typhoid moved through towns like this one in periodic waves, along with dysentery in the warmer months, and both hit hardest among small children, whose bodies had the least reserve to survive a bad case of either. The Cobbs had already buried one child before Mercy, a first daughter born between Ruth and Josiah, who lived 11 months before a summer fever took her. Eliza rarely spoke of it, and by the standards of the time, this wasn't unusual reticence. It was simply how a family in this era carried a loss that so many other families around them had carried too. There was no company doctor, no factory infirmary, nothing resembling what we'd now call healthcare tied to employment. Illness meant either affording whatever a local doctor charged for a visit, or relying on herbal remedies and home nursing passed down through the women of the village, the same quiet network of mutual aid that had shown up for the injured girl on the carding floor showing up again, in a different form, whenever fever moved through someone's rented rooms. There was no real concept of adolescence in a mill village in 1841, no protected stretch of years set aside simply for growing up before the world asked anything serious of you. Ruth, at 10, was already a working member of the household economy, her wages folded directly into whatever the Cobb family brought home each week. Josiah, at 7, was considered too young for the machines, but not too young for real responsibility. Minding his infant sister for full days at a stretch was, in the language of the time, simply what a boy his age was expected to do. Formal schooling, where it existed at all for children like these, competed directly with the wages a working child brought home. And in a family living as close to the margin as the Cobbs did, wages usually won. A push was building elsewhere in New England throughout this very decade. Reformers like Horace Mann in Massachusetts were arguing hard for what came to be called the Common School movement, free and universal education regardless of a family's income. But that movement was still young, still uneven, and it would be years yet before it meaningfully reached mill children working full shifts 6 days a week in towns like Woonsocket. For now, whatever education Ruth received came in scraps. A few winter months some years when mill work slowed, lessons from Eliza in the rare quiet hour. Letters sounded out from whatever printed material happened to pass through the house. What Ruth had instead of a childhood in the modern sense was a rapid, thorough education in the actual mechanics of survival. How to read a machine's rhythm well enough to know when it was about to jam. How to move fast enough near an unguarded gear to avoid becoming the next cautionary story on the street. How to fold her own small wages into a household budget that left no real room for waste. By 12, in towns exactly like this one, a mill child wasn't considered remarkable for knowing all of this. She was considered ordinary. Depending on where you were standing in 1841, this exact state looked like 4 entirely different places. From where Nathaniel Cobb stood, Rhode Island was a place where hard work bought you almost nothing beyond survival. Not property, not a vote, not real security against the machines he worked 12 hours a day to feed. His labor built the state's wealth as surely as anyone's, and his name appeared nowhere in the ledger deciding how that wealth, or that state's government, actually got governed. His whole world ran on a bell he didn't own, in a village he didn't own, under a law he'd had no hand in writing. From where a mill owner stood, comfortably a landholder many times over, Rhode Island was a well-ordered, prosperous state whose government worked exactly as it should, rewarding the responsible, property-owning citizens who'd built it, and rightly excluding those who hadn't yet earned a stake in it. His world looked considerably different from Nathaniel's. A handsome home in Providence proper, a pew near the front of a well-appointed church, a seat on the boards of the banks and insurance houses that financed the very mills men like Nathaniel worked in. To this man, the charter wasn't an injustice. It was simply proof that the system was functioning as designed, and Door's movement looked less like a fight for fairness than an attempt by people who hadn't yet earned anything to simply vote themselves a share of what he'd built. From where an Irish Catholic canal laborer stood, Rhode Island was a place that badly wanted his labor and just as badly didn't want him, happy to employ him, slower to trust him, and entirely unwilling, under either the old charter or the loudest reform proposal on the table, to fully count him as a citizen, no matter how many years he'd already spent digging its canals and running its looms. He'd watched neighbors born in this country win, at least on paper, a promise of full inclusion that year. His own family, having built no small part of the physical state itself with their own hands, would keep waiting. And from where a free black barber in Providence stood, a man we're about to meet properly. Rhode Island was a state where even the loudest voices demanding the people be allowed to rule had already quietly decided before a single vote was cast that he wasn't included in that particular word. He'd spent over a decade building the patient, unglamorous machinery of organized protest, petitions, newspapers, alliances, only to watch a much louder, much more sudden movement claim the language of universal rights while drawing its boundary directly around him. 4 different Rhode Islands, occupying the exact same 12 months, each one entirely convinced it understood what the state actually was. Underneath all 4 of those experiences sat the same strange legal fact. Rhode Island in 1841 had no state constitution at all. It was still governed by a royal charter granted by King Charles II in 1663. a document written before anyone alive had ever used the word American to describe themselves, drawn up for a colony of scattered farms that bore almost no resemblance to the mill towns now operating under its rules. That charter allowed only men who owned at least $134 of land, or their eldest sons, to vote. In 1663, when nearly everyone farmed their own plot, that looked reasonably fair. By the 1840s, with mills like the one employing the Cobb family, pulling thousands of landless families into towns exactly like Woonsocket, it had quietly become something else, a rule that, almost by accident, locked out roughly 6 in 10 free white men in the entire state, Nathaniel among them, along with every woman and nearly every black resident regardless of what they owned. The man who tried to break that rule was, of all people, a Harvard-educated lawyer from one of Providence's wealthiest mill-owning families. Thomas Wilson Dorr organized a movement calling itself the Rhode Island Suffrage Association, and in October of 1841, it held its own unauthorized convention and drafted a People's Constitution, striking the landholding requirement for native-born men entirely, along with fixing a legislature so badly apportioned that a handful of rural towns held as much power as the entire city of Providence combined. When Providence's free black community, led by activists like the barber Alfred Niger, a man who had spent over a decade quietly building anti-slavery organizing networks across the state, asked to be included in this new, supposedly universal suffrage, the Suffrage Association said no. They calculated, correctly, that adding black suffrage to the platform would cost them white working-class votes. They couldn't afford to lose. It's a hard truth, sitting right in the middle of this reform movement. A fight framed as the people versus an unjust government drew its own excluding line the moment inclusion became politically inconvenient. By the spring of 1842, Rhode Island had 2 men claiming to be governor at once. Dorr, sworn in on the 3rd of May under the People's Constitution, and Samuel Ward King, still holding the armory, the courts, and the charter government's recognition from every other state in the Union. For roughly 6 weeks, neither the Cobbs nor anyone else in the state could say with certainty which government's officers had the authority to tax them, arrest them, or call them to militia service. Martial law followed King's response. So did mass arrests and a $5,000 bounty on Dorr's own head, as though the state's wealthiest defendant had suddenly become its most wanted fugitive. On the night of May 17, 1842, Dorr and several hundred armed supporters marched on the state arsenal in Providence to seize it by force. Among the men defending it on the other side were Thomas Dorr's own father and uncle. The attack collapsed almost before it started. The cannon aimed at the gate simply wouldn't fire, and within a day, Rhode Island's second governor was fleeing his own state on horseback. As tensions built that spring, roughly 400 black men, Niger's community among them, had volunteered for the militia defending the charter government, not out of any real loyalty to a system that had generally treated them badly, but as a calculated bet that standing firmly against a movement that had excluded them might finally earn the state's attention in a way a decade of petitions hadn't. Governor King appealed to President John Tyler for federal troops. Tyler sent an observer but declined to intervene, judging the danger to be fading on its own. A small, telling decision from the man about to become considerably more central to the country's story in our very next chapter. Dorr made one final stand at Chepachet that June, gathering what supporters he had left in the state's rural northwest, and when the charter militia arrived in overwhelming numbers, he ordered his own men to disperse rather than fight. The rebellion, in any real military sense, was over within 8 months of starting, and had cost, by most tallies, a single life across the entire episode. The irony landed the following year. Rhode Island's new 1843 Constitution extended the vote to Nathaniel Cobb and men like him for the first time in his adult life, but kept the property requirement squarely in place for anyone foreign-born. meaning the Halloran family down the street, and Irish neighbors who'd stood beside the same reform movement still couldn't vote under it. And in a genuine surprise, that same constitution extended suffrage to black men for the first time in the state's history, when Providence voters rejected a proposed white restriction by a margin of roughly 13-1, largely as a direct reward for the community that had stood against the very uprising that tried to exclude them from its promise. Dorr himself returned the following year, was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. Public sympathy shifted fast once the sentence was handed down. He was pardoned within roughly a year, a broken and largely forgotten man in the very state he'd tried to reform. It's worth asking, who benefited most from a system that kept wages this low and hours this long for this many years running? And the answer runs a good deal further than the mill owner's front office. The mills feeding Rhode Island's economy ran, almost entirely, on raw cotton grown hundreds of miles south, picked by enslaved labor on plantations most mill families would never see in their lives. Northern textile fortunes and Southern slavery were tied together by a supply chain nobody in Woonsocket needed to think about consciously to benefit, or suffer from directly. A bolt of cheap cotton cloth touched the hands of an enslaved field worker in Mississippi long before it ever reached Eliza Cobb's sewing basket. And the banks and shipping firms handling that cotton along the way, many of them based in the same New England cities where abolitionist newspapers were printed, drew real profit from every step of the journey. Meanwhile, the mill owners who ran towns like this one controlled the wages, the housing, the store prices, and, until 1843, the entire political process deciding whether any of that could ever be challenged. That concentration of power wasn't hidden through conspiracy. It was hidden simply through distance and habit. Nobody expected to trace their own paycheck back through the mill owner's ledger to a plantation account in another state entirely, any more than the mill owner expected a Providence family to trace its own wealth back to a bank account quietly built on cotton. There's a second, less visible layer sitting underneath even that. The company store where Eliza bought flour and the company landlord who owned the Cobb's 2 rented rooms weren't separate businesses competing for the family's limited wages. They were often the same enterprise, extending credit against next week's pay and collecting it back the moment that pay arrived. A family could work a full week and, on paper, never quite get ahead of what it already owed the same hand that employed it. This wasn't unique to Woonsocket. It was close to the standard operating model across mill villages throughout New England, and it meant that for a great many families, the 12-hour day wasn't simply exhausting. It was structured, quietly and legally, to be very difficult to ever fully step outside of. Some of this should feel uncomfortably familiar. 12- and 13-hour workdays sound extreme today, and it took nearly a full century after the Cobb's time, well into the 20th, before a standard work week was written into federal law at all. But the fight over how many hours an employer can reasonably ask of a worker never fully ended. It simply moved into new industries, with new versions of the same argument about what a fair day actually costs a person. Company towns, where the employer is also the landlord and the shopkeeper, have mostly disappeared in the literal sense. But the underlying vulnerability of depending on a single employer for nearly everything in your life, your income, your housing, sometimes your health care, hasn't disappeared with them. It's simply taken quieter, less architecturally obvious forms. The suspicion Ruth's Irish neighbors faced didn't end with the 19th century either. Nearly every wave of immigration into this country since has met some version of the same pattern. Welcomed for its labor, distrusted for its difference, and made to wait far longer than seems fair for the same rights and the same trust extended more easily to whoever arrived just one generation earlier. And the specific fight the Cobbs lived through, who counts as enough of a citizen to be handed a vote, never actually resolved in 1843 either. It simply changed its terms and kept going, decade after decade, all the way to arguments still being had today about who gets counted, how easily, and who gets to decide. Historians still disagree on how to file Dorr's rebellion away. One reading treats him as a genuine democratic reformer undone by an entrenched elite unwilling to share power peacefully, proof of how stubbornly power resists giving up even a modest piece of itself. Another treats him as proof of something less flattering, that the people, even in the mouths of its loudest champions, has always been a phrase someone gets to define narrower than it sounds, right up until the moment inclusion becomes convenient again. Both readings rest on the exact same set of facts. That's usually the sign of a story worth sitting with, rather than resolving neatly for the sake of a tidy ending. There's a second, quieter debate, too, closer to the Cobb's own experience. Some historians argue that the Rhode Island system, with its emphasis on whole families working together rather than isolating individual laborers the way the Lowell model did, actually preserved a measure of household authority and cohesion that other early industrial systems stripped away. Others argue this framing is far too generous, that keeping children on the factory floor under the banner of family labor simply extended the workday's damage across an entire household rather than sparing anyone from it, dressing up child labor in the more comfortable language of family unity. If there's a lesson sitting quietly underneath all of this, it isn't a triumphant one, and I don't think it's meant to be. Notice, first, how much of what actually held this village together happened nowhere near a ballot box or a constitutional convention. It happened in a boarding house front room where a letter from Ireland got read aloud. It happened in a collection taken up in one evening for a family who'd lost a daughter's arm to a gear nobody had bothered to guard. Real resilience here rarely looked dramatic. It looked like people quietly absorbing each other's hardship because the system built above them had made it clear it wasn't going to. Notice, too, how easily a movement built entirely on the language of fairness drew its own exception the moment fairness became inconvenient. Dorr's supporters weren't hypocrites in some cartoonish sense. They were, by most accounts, sincere people fighting a genuine injustice, who nonetheless found it easy to leave someone else's injustice sitting untouched on the table beside their own. That's a pattern worth sitting with, rather than filing safely away as something only that particular decade was capable of. And notice, last, how much of what actually changed in 1843 came not from the loudest uprising, but from the quieter, longer campaign that Alfred Niger and Providence's black community had been waging for years before Dorr's name ever entered the story. Petitions, organizing, newspapers, patient arguments sustained across a decade that finally cashed out, almost sideways, through a crisis they hadn't started and hadn't been allowed to fully join. There's one more piece worth sitting with, closer to Nathaniel and Eliza's own kitchen table than to any state house. Almost nothing about their year changed because of a speech, a pamphlet, or a vote they were finally allowed to cast. It changed, day to day, because a neighbor covered a shift without being asked, because a boarding house front room became a gathering place for people with nowhere else to belong, because a woman sat up all night with a stranger's grief, simply because the system above her offered no better alternative. History remembers Dorr's name. It was Eliza's kind of quiet, unglamorous endurance that actually kept the village standing long enough for 1843 to arrive at all. If you're watching this from anywhere in the United States today, some real, traceable piece of your own daily life runs back through exactly this kind of year. Not necessarily this exact state, but this exact pattern, repeated in dozens of mill towns and factory villages across the entire industrializing North throughout this decade. The basic assumption that a workday has some outer limit, that a worker deserves some floor beneath their wages, that a child belongs in a schoolroom rather than standing on a wooden block at a spinning frame. None of that arrived automatically. It was fought for, unevenly and incompletely, by people like the Cobbs and their neighbors, most of whom never lived to see the fight actually won. And if you're an American today, you're also the inheritor of the other half of this story. An economy that ran, quite literally, on cotton picked by people who owned nothing, including themselves, and on suspicion aimed at whichever community had arrived most recently. None of that inheritance cancels out the other. Both are simply true at once, the way they were true at once in Woonsocket in 1841, sitting inside the same 12 months, the same mill bell, the same crowded street. Nathaniel Cobb almost certainly never met Thomas Dorr, Alfred Niger, or Governor King in person, and he appears nowhere in a single surviving record of the events that reshaped the government above his head. That's true of nearly everyone this story actually happened to. History remembers the man who marched on the arsenal. It rarely remembers the mill hand who simply kept showing up for his shift, while two governments argued over whether his vote existed at all. But by 1843, something in his world actually had changed. However imperfectly, however unevenly distributed, the property requirement that had locked him out of his own government for his entire adult life was gone. His path to the ballot box, for the first time, ran through nothing more than his birthplace and his tax receipt. A path still closed that same year to the Irish family 2 doors down, and only just opened through a strange and largely unplanned reward to Providence's black community. The dispute didn't stay confined to Rhode Island for long, either. A case growing directly out of these events, Luther versus Borden, reached the United States Supreme Court by the end of the decade, forcing the federal government to wrestle publicly with a question it had never really had to answer before. Who decides when a state's own people disagree about which government is legitimate? Somewhere in Woonsocket today, the mill buildings mostly still stand, repurposed now into apartments and studios, the water wheel long since gone quiet. Nobody walking past them thinks about the bell that used to run the whole village's day, or the family that stood at the machines inside answering it. But the argument that reshaped their world that year, over wages, over belonging, over who actually gets to be counted, never really left. It just kept moving, the way it always has, toward the next room where someone else would be left arguing over exactly the same question. Ruth Cobb, by the family's own later account, lived long enough to see the 10-hour day finally become the standard in Rhode Island's mills, decades after the campaign that had failed so badly in her own childhood. She never became anyone history remembers by name. She simply grew up, kept working, watched her own children start further ahead than she had, and passed down, the way Eliza had passed down to her, the particular quiet toughness of a family that had gotten through a hard year by leaning on the people standing next to it. And in Washington, the president who'd quietly declined to send troops into Rhode Island was about to find himself running the entire country, sooner and more suddenly than anyone expected. That's where we're headed next.